So just a brief introduction from myself. We would like to give a book award for Laura's latest book. I don't know if any of you have read her original book. I thought it was great. I always, in my data governance course, I talk about some of the thought leaders, and it's really nice to be able to see the change. I don't know if you've noticed, but John Ladley is now sitting in a semi-retired state, and we're getting a new set of thought leaders coming through. And it was really nice to read Laura's first book. She really challenged a lot of the things that we had been doing and the value that we had been promising, and just the way in which we were behaving. So please, I would recommend that you read both books. But I will be awarding a book to someone who asks or improves the level of engagement. Okay, so asks appropriate question or really gets us to think about what Laura has said and what's happening. So we'll look forward to that. We'll make the announcement at the end. I will try to manage the questions as we go. Laura's happy for you to, if you can ask a question during the slides, I'll try to find a nice time to interrupt and then just present those questions to Laura. Laura, thank you so much for everything that you've done and the books that you've written. It's been great reading them and appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I oddly enjoy writing books. I don't think my husband enjoys when I write books.
Yeah.
Different pressure point, I suppose. So,
Sure.
all right, well, we'll get started. Let me see if I can share my screen without the technology issues popping up, which, loves to happen. Just get this guy out of the way. All right. Excellent. Yeah, so as Howard said, happy to have questions pop up as we go along. This book is brand new. It was released July 1st. And so this is actually the first time I'll be talking about it. So be kind. But I have not covered the content and in this way. And, some of it is as a result of writing a book. I haven't really thought about it for about a year. So if we can start it here. All right. So just, we have to start off with an agenda, right? You got to tell them what you're going to tell them, and then you tell them what you told them. But so the first thing I did is really in the book talk about what artificial intelligence is. So we're going to spend a little bit of time understanding AI. I'll give you a little story as to how I wrote the book or why I end up writing the book, because it actually does, I think it gives us a good sort of perspective into what's happening in the data world right now with AI. We'll talk about data because we have to, because there's actually some really interesting things that are happening in the data industry in terms of how we present ourselves, and in some respects, the bifurcation that's happening in the data industry for corporations or enterprises against the data industry that is doing, quote unquote, building AI. Then we're going to talk a little bit about sustainable disruption, because one of the things that's pretty clear to me, and probably most of you that have spent any time in data and in this space and just existing on the planet Earth lately, disruption seems to be a lot more commonplace. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and how we balance disruption so that it doesn't always feel like we're, in the midst of chaos. There's concepts around future ready, and we'll talk a little bit about what it means to be future ready. For a long time in data, future proofing was a thing. So we're going to debunk a couple of myths, associated with future proofing. Then we're going to bring that all together, and we'll have plenty of time for questions probably at the end and all the way throughout. So looking forward to the conversation. Good?
That's great.
Excellent. So I'll tell you a little story about how I came to write the book. So every year, me and my business partner kind of get together to do our strategic planning for the year and kind of think about what we want to do and how we want to do it. And at the time, she sort of casually mentioned to me that she was using ChatGPT to write some marketing blurbs. We're a small group, and we have a half-time person that helps us with marketing, but it's a lot of work to, do the things that we do, support our clients, plus do all the marketing that we have to do so that we're top of mind. And so she just kind of casually mentioned to me that she was using, as everyone else was at the time, ChatGPT as sort of a productivity aid. And I got really upset. Uh, and I think a lot of it at the time, and maybe even still now, was because I felt like a lot of the stuff that was happening around ChatGPT at the time and how we were talking about AI at the time was really unsettling to me as a career at that point in my career, right? So I've been in data for 25 years. I have, for the most part, 20 plus years of that career, I have run and built data warehouses. I have run analytic teams. I have been in the front line, in the trenches, really doing that work. And most of that, although we're getting close to it being about half now, was in enterprises or in organizations. And the other part, of course, is as an advisor or consultant. And so, I just started thinking about AI and what it was going to do to the data industry, the industry that I had spent so much time in, how organizations were going to navigate through this when most of the organizations that I've worked for or worked with, struggle to do the basics, what we would consider to be basic data management functions. It's one of the reasons I wrote the book about data governance, because I feel like most organizations cannot get out of their own way when it comes to data governance. We violate almost every best practice around data management because some executive asks us to do that because something has to be done quickly. We're violating all kinds of things. And now all of a sudden we have AI in which the speed and scale of this disruption is going to be way faster than we've ever anticipated or expected before. So it really felt unsettling, and I sort of felt like the proverbial rug was ripped out from under me, in my career. And so, just kind of being the person I am, I felt like, what, if AI, whatever that means, is going to take my career, I'm going to understand it while it's doing it. And as I
Yeah.
started looking at AI and the role of it, data, and specifically the application of thinking about what we have done in our organizations as data leaders, right? And how those two things come together, that's what this book was really turning out to be. So that's the story of the book and how we got here. I think it's Voltaire that says something about if you can't define the thing, it's going to get you in the end. And so, of course, just like with anything, I did this with governance too when I wrote the book about data governance, um, which actually was my third book. I wrote two books around healthcare analytics. Um,
Wow.
so when I went to define artificial intelligence, it was difficult to do, right? Because depending on where you go, what you're learning, who you're following, right, in our modern worlds, it's either everything or it's nothing. And it is extremely difficult to pinpoint exactly what we're talking about, right? We can get fluffy words. So ChatGPT defines artificial intelligence as computer systems or software that performs tasks that humans do, right? It's trying to do things that has typically required human intelligence. So according to ChatGPT, that includes learning, reasoning, problem solving, perception, understanding. Um, if you've ever used ChatGPT, you know it kind of fails. And most of these tools are like that. And obviously there are models that are different that do certain things a little bit better than others. We're not going to get into that, but um, the whole idea behind AI was to mimic intelligence, to mimic human cognition. And it was started many years ago, and we'll look at a timeline here in a little bit. But well, for one thing, it's like my first thought was like, why? Like, why bother? Seems like a lot of work to mimic human cognition when you have humans cogniting all the time. Um, but that was always the intention, right? And the interesting thing is there's a gentleman named Minsky that was part of the original four that sort of the coined the term artificial intelligence. And he has a definition of things called suitcase words. So words that kind of mean different things depending on the context. And I think that's where artificial intelligence really lands. It means something different to everybody depending on the context, right? And which is why we find ourselves as like AI is either everything or it's nothing, right? It's vaporware or it's, going to take your job from you, which is what I was feeling when I first started this process. One of the things I tried to come up with is sort of a litmus test for organizations to see if when you think about AI, that you kind of know where you're at, right? Like either you're doing it or you're not doing it. And there are, even at that point, right, different ways of doing it versus not doing it. But one of the things I did not do in this book is I did not write a lot about how you create AI from scratch, right? Because most organizations would not be able to do that. And the primary reason why is first thing you need is big data, right?
Mm.
So with all of the data people on the call, we could all probably spend the hour talking about what big data is. But the whole point being here, you need a lot of data in order to do AI. We're talking billions, if not trillions of rows. So you need big data, then you need computing power. So obviously, we're probably going to have to be in the cloud. But even with that, it is a very specific set of computing power that allows you to use that billions, if not trillions of rows of data and apply very sophisticated statistical methodologies or models to it. And that is essentially what AI is. It's tons of data, really solid computing power, and statistics. Most of our organizations probably will not be in a place where we're going to be able to do all three of those to build AI from scratch. Um, as AI gets more and more commercialized, we will find that there will be a little bit of like starter kits where we can get started, like somebody else is going to do that part, and then we'll customize models or personalize them, as we have seen with ChatGPT. Moxie even did that during the process of writing the book, so we could understand and experience what that felt like. So we created a chat bot for data governance to see what that looked like in terms of customizing that model. So that's kind of what AI ended up when I started writing. It's like, okay, so this is what we're thinking about. Like AI initially was mimicking cognition. What we're trying to deal with, reality, is lots of data, solid computing power, and really sophisticated statistical methods. And almost everything in between is that murky suitcase thing that we have to navigate depending on the situation and the organization. So let's kind of look at a little bit of a timeline. And there are several timelines that you can find online, and they're all a little bit different, right? So this
Sorry,
timeline
Laura.
was, oh yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Sorry. So just there are a couple of questions. One from
Oh,
myself, in terms of, if we apply some of the models even to our transactions, you can see the accountants doing it in terms of fraud analysis, and that whole is it dependent on big data? Do you have to have it, or is it, it depends on the transactional data sets that you have? I see some of the telecom people using it. Of course, they've got lots of data. Whether we consider it big data or not, that's
mm.
another debate. But um, is it only applicable within the big data area, or I mean, can we have benefits to our own transactions?
Yeah, I think, you can customize an existing model with smaller sets of data. And that's completely feasible.
Right.
So the scenario in which, you use ChatGPT, but you personalize it, and there's different ways to do that based on those different baseline models. But the reality is, in order to do artificial intelligence, and this is the big artificial intelligence, right? Not the
Right.
AI washing that we're all seeing, right?
Right.
You
Right.
need a lot of data. because the way that these algorithms are working, right? They need to be able to have that computing power to predict. And if you only have, even if you only have 1,000,000 rows, thinking about this idea of trying to mimic that cognition with 1,000,000 rows, you're never going to get all those variables essentially to control enough to be able to identify the next thing in terms of that mimicking cognition. So if we're truly talking about AI as it was originally sort of identified and thought of, you need a lot of data.
Okay. Fantastic. And then Magella asked a question. Magella, I'm not sure if I fully understand it. She said AI reasoning. Magella, I'm not sure if exactly what your question is.
Yeah. No. Hi. Hello.
Hello.
Yes, because of in the definition of artificial intelligence, and that this does include learning, reasoning, problem solving, and perception, and etc. My question is really reasoning. I really, has like a process for reasoning and for decision making. That's my question.
So the question really is,
Like a comment, okay?
Yeah, can AI really reason? And no. I mean, we've seen tons of examples of that. It does not.
Well,
it
yes,
is, yeah.
Laura, I understand the reasoning and the decision making process, but the definition mentioned as well, like a mimic, maybe AI. Sorry, I confused with the Spanish. But artificial intelligence maybe mimic reasoning and mimic decision making. For me, this is my comment.
Yeah.
Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Were there other questions?
There's one more that's just come about. Gabriel talks about cognition. One of the many weasel words or suitcase words. Do we mean appearance of intelligence because a bot appears to speak coherently?
Yeah. And I think, this is one of the reasons why it's so squirrely and difficult to get a hold of, right? Because cognition can mean lots of things to lots of different people. If you look at definitions of cognition, it can literally mean thought process. Well, that's you can't unpack a thought process. Although that is exactly what these predictive algorithms are doing, is unpacking thought processes, breaking them down into extremely tiny steps, right? In order to get us to that final sort of decision or piece of information or whatever we're seeking. But yes, suitcase word for sure.
Okay.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Yes, of course. All right, so AI timeline. Like I said, there's a lot of these out on the internet. This one's just the one that I created as I was walking through this because I felt like these were some of the more important sort of stopping points, right, along our AI journey. So obviously, lots of big strides have happened over the last several years. But the term artificial intelligence was officially coined in 1956 during a week a summer research project. I mentioned the original 4 at Dartmouth College. So the fascinating thing is they thought, well, this artificial intelligence thing that we want to do, this mimicking cognition, we should be able to just do that if we just apply ourselves over the summer, because they were college professors. So the 4 of them brought a bunch of students, and they're like, well, we're going to do it over the summer in 1956. Of course, they found out that they couldn't. But that is when the original term was coined. And as a result of that, right, research continued past that 1956. They really felt like that's the thing. We're going to move forward. And so they continued to do some research and do the analysis and create statistical methods and try to solve this problem. And it ended up getting some money and some funding from government agencies and universities, private donors. And in 1974 was the first AI winter. So AI winter essentially is when the hype cycle gets too much, right? So it's like, oh, it's going to solve everything. Let's put money at it. And then all that money evolves to nothing. And then no money, money goes away. And then the research stops or slows down. So there have been a couple of AI winters as a result of that hype cycle. And 1974 was the first one. And then in 1982, an influx of money came back because of some article that was written as a result of some of the research that was done subsequent to that 1974. And there was some dynamics and politics that happened in there that I won't get into, but essentially a really important person said AI is dumb and it's never going to happen. And then all the money goes away. And then between 74 and 82, a whole bunch of people continue to research because they think that's not true. And then they find that there's still interest in it. And so an influx of money starts to happen in 1982. And algorithms are expanded as a result. But you have to keep in mind that in 1982, the data in the world was relatively limited. It existed, but it all existed on sheets of paper, right? And so it was very difficult for them to have enough data as an input, and they certainly didn't have the computing power. So really, really, in 1993 is what started all this. And that was when the internet went live. And it seems like, okay, well, what does that have to do with anything? Well, has to do with a lot of things, but essentially you started having more computing power and you started to have data and data that was digitized. And the influx of that data and the digitization and then computing power, right, really kicked this off. So then you start to see a whole bunch of stuff that happens in a pretty fast pace. So 1997, that chess win happens by Deep Blue, IBM, right? And IBM doubles down on this part of AI. They think, oh, we've got this. If we can, chess is a very strategic game, and if we can get a software system to beat this chess expert, right? We figured out AI. I don't know why people, so that happened in 1997. And then during the early 2000s, the era of big data begins. And so for those of us that have been in data a really long time, I remember this very distinctly because I used to point and laugh at people when they started talking about big data, But big data, and this is where we start to see the bifurcation of the two parts of the industry, means very different things to different people. And but the most important thing from an AI perspective is we needed more data because we had these really sophisticated algorithms that could not do the thing that they needed to do without all that data. And so that proceeded, and in 2008, the world exceeded 1 million gigaflops, which all that really means is we have a lot of data, and then we had a lot of computing power, right? So, and there's the Moore's law where, it expands exponentially. We're there. So we have the advent of the internet, which creates all of the computing power and the digitization. In 2008, we start exceeding 1 million gigaflops. And post 2008, the other interesting thing happens, which I don't write on here because I just don't think I could have brought myself to do it, social media. So on social media, we are all digitizing all of that data for them, right? And so that is really, really what kicked this off. Social media is what kicked off particularly ChatGPT, because up to this point, a lot of artificial intelligence analysis was happening around like audio files, which is why you can say, hey, Siri, oh, and get some kind of response, right? So it was on audio files, it was on images, but it wasn't really on data or any kind of analysis because they just didn't have enough of it. So social media came in, everybody's commenting on everything, and all of a sudden, right, they have enough data to create these models, and that is what brought us to ChatGPT being released in 2022. Which felt like a surprise to me at the time, actually. I was like, what? So here's the thing about data. For me, and probably most of you, data means something binary, right? It is the culmination of something that happens in our systems, but it's almost always a number. And when we visualize data, we visualize it as numbers. And most of the systems that we bring into our quote unquote data warehouses, data repositories, are numbers. But 80% of the world's data is actually unstructured or semi-structured. So all of that comments that is happening on social media, right? And when we look at what AI is doing and using, it is using unstructured and semi-structured data almost exclusively. So all that ChatGPT stuff, right? All of the other things that we're starting to see in that space right now around that generative AI is all based on unstructured and semi-structured data, which, by the way, they turn into binary through these very sophisticated statistical methods, right? So when I talk about data in the context of AI, I'm talking about all three. So we're talking about structured, which is very easy for AI to handle, right? Because it's binary and machine readable code, unstructured and semi-structured data. All right. So I've talked a couple times about the bifurcation that's happening in the industry. And this was really fascinating to me. I came to this conclusion during the research for the book, right? Because I never really thought about it before that. But even if you read articles from like that 2008, 2010 timeframe, talking about big data at the time, talking about statistical methods, none of it resonated to me as somebody that was leading a data warehouse team, right? I was like, I don't even know, like, how do they talk about this way? It doesn't make any sense to me. Well, we're using the same words, but it means very different things to these two different groups, right? So when we talk about big data, right, in our world, in our parlance, it's always been the 5 V's, you know, velocity, volume, value, blah, 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 blah. For for data for AI or ML, machine learning, it's trillions of rows of data. That's what they mean by big data. They literally mean lots of data, right? But for us, it was this different way of thinking about how to just consume that binary data that we were bringing into our data warehouses. From a data science perspective, when you're talking about it for the enterprise or industry, the work that we do for companies, data science is someone who can take the data wherever it is and answer questions. So they weren't necessarily restricted or limited to our data repositories. They could go out to operational systems and still pull numerical data, right? But they were not necessarily limited to systems that we were consolidating and bringing together. And the AI ML world, data science means somebody who can take the data and create a model. So it's different, right? And I mean, you may end up with a model in the industry side, but what you're primarily looking for, because we couldn't keep up with the pace, is data scientists that had the ability to code data to pull from any kind of system. And then they would maybe use some statistical algorithms, but a lot of times they were just trying to answer basic questions, but we just couldn't keep up with the level of requests. That's what a lot of data science is in most organizations that I work with. And then we talk about the data lake. So, you know, and of course, we all joke, you know, data lake, data swamp, whatever, blah, blah, blah. But in our world, in our parlance, it has always been sort of that architectural principle in which you take similar types of data, usually structured data, right? We're still dealing with that. And we drop them into literal tables. And then we transform them. So we kind of went from like ETL, extract, transform, and load, to extract, load, transform. And that was one of the big keys of data lake. It's like, oh, well, we can't take the time, right, to transform it before we load it. We're under pressure. So we're going to create this lake and we're going to pull all that data over. I used to call it the suck and plunk. And we're going to pull that data over. And then we'll sort of logically categorize it into domains, if you will. And so that's what we consider data lakes to be. And for that, primarily was used for reports, sometimes analysis, but dashboards, things like that. It was to run our organizations, right? Answer the questions that we were getting in our organizations. In the AI world, data lake was being created so they could take data from any source. Because they were dealing with billions and trillions of rows from data points that they had no context for. They couldn't build models data models to bring that in because they had no context for it. They were, pulling data from all kinds of places in social media and Twitter, the places like that. So it wasn't like they could, create a column and say, this is what that column is. They were literally just taking data from any source, creating concepts or what we would consider to be domain types, but they were very broad concepts. And then they would drop that data regardless to type, right? Into a closest sort of concept table, but it wasn't like a DDL. It wasn't like what you and I would consider to be a true table in order to run numerical analysis. And then they would use that table to feed the data. So their transform ended up being a bunch of statistical methods to turn that unstructured or semi-structured data into something that was machine readable, then to go off and do the thing. So that's the different, that's AI, the ML part of AI. So when we think about data for the two spots, right, in our worlds, it was primarily binary, numbers, very structured. And in AI and ML, it's been unstructured, primarily text. And so when I was even in the early phases of this reading a lot of the stuff, that was the part that was like, well, of course, none of these are wrong. We were using these tools in order to do the thing we needed to do in our organizations. But we were using the same words and meaning different things because the stuff that the AI part of the industry had to do was very, very different than what we have to do in order to support our organizations. Pause there.
Yeah, there is a question from Gabriel, and but he's saying binary data being the easiest for LLMs. His comment there is, on the contrary, it's probably the hardest because it lacks rich human readable context setting, something that Barry Devlin commented on due to organizations' excellence at data management. Gabriel, I'm not sure if I understand exactly what you're saying. Are you saying that the binary data is not easy to handle?
It is the focus of enterprises today to use generative AI to improve the efficiency and whatever profits out of their business processes, which primarily deal with structured data. Yep. And it's damn hard because the LLMs are tuned to language, which does not, by and large, exist around the records because we haven't tagged them, we haven't governed them, we haven't described them. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, you're absolutely spot on, right? Data, numbers lack context. And all the particularly generative AI is built around context, like that word vector predicting the next word kind of thing.
Yeah.
So one of the biggest challenges we have as data professionals is bridging the gap between the structured, the unstructured, and the semi-structured in order to solve the problem of quote unquote AI for our companies, which is not an easy thing to do, which is actually some of the reason why in the early mid 2000s, we kind of created this bifurcation between the two because the stuff that they were doing, the stuff that we needed to do was very different. That's why I say it wasn't wrong. It was very different, the purpose and intention between the two. Yeah. Anything else there?
No, that's it.
Okay. So, it's sort of like, well, okay, so now that we know that, right? By the way, that barely scratches the surface. There's so much to know about AI, right? And I would not consider myself at all, by any stretch of the imagination, to be an AI expert. There's an enormous amount of information and understanding that have to happen in general, and we'll all get there eventually over time as it becomes more and more a part of our natural, sort of parlance in the world. There were a couple of books that I read that were really revolutionary for me in terms of learning about this. One of them is this book by Melanie Mitchell called Artificial Intelligence, A Guide for Thinking Humans. And so she breaks all this stuff down for us in a really very easy to understand way. She actually teaches, she's a professor of artificial intelligence. So one of the things, I actually interviewed her for the book, and one of the things that became very obvious to me was that whole, like, what does AI actually mean? Because you can use it and it means nothing, right? So that was really an interesting conversation I had with her, but it is an excellent book. But this is part of our challenge, right? There's just a lot to be understood. There's a lot in AI, hence the suitcase part. But this, sort of this unstructured data from here, from Reddit to Twitter, everything in between, was really harvested to create the models that we all love today. We enjoy using them. I did use a ChatGPT a couple times during this writing of my book as well. Those methods were created as predictive formulas and creating word vectors. So, and this is how all those things work. But the work of AI today is to take all of that unstructured data, such as those posts, Flickr images, audio, and turn them into machine readable code. So from here to what we're actually looking at in terms of how we use this in our own organizations. Does it change their productivity? How does it change the productivity? From ChatGPT to the Copilot, Google image searches, even Google Translate, which has gotten much better in the last few years. They're all based on relatively basic AI functions. And I call it basic because the main goal of AI is still to mimic cognition. And they're not really doing that yet, right? So with these just being the beginning, right? And the amount of disruption that has barely scratched the surface, where does that leave us? And that was really, for me, what caught me a little bit off guard, was when I first started thinking about writing this book, and that feeling I had, right, of sort of this like somewhere between fear of missing out and abject terror.
Yeah.
Right. That's kind of what it feels like right now, as we're all navigating and living through this, especially those of us that have been in the data industry for a long time.
Yeah.
We have a situation where, we went from an industry where it was a handful of us that would, talk in the corner because we understood what each other was saying, to now it's on the nightly news.
Yeah.
Using terms that we're all familiar with using. And so the level of disruption is pretty significant. And one of the things I started to think about was, how do we create a sustainable amount of disruption in our organizations? How do we create something that feels like we can actually navigate through these choppy waters? Because the only thing I know for sure is that this is going to be a rough couple of years as we figure this out, right? And so one of the things I came up with was what I'm calling a thought model, right? And the whole idea here is that not all disruption is the same, right? So difficult to call the disruption of AI and ChatGPT on the same level of the disruption of, say, COVID, right? But it's disruption nonetheless. And as a person, you're navigating both of them we were navigating both of them in many respects at the same time. Not all people want to disrupt, right? And so how do you take all of this stuff that's coming at you in your organizations, happening today? Somebody calls me and says, I need an AI strategy and I don't even know what that means. Well, yeah, okay, nobody knows what that means. We're all figuring this out real time, right? We're all living through this revolution real time. So how can we manage to do that and not burn ourselves out, or not take these changes seriously, which I think happens sometimes. You kind of feel like you're going to wait it out, right? I have a funny story about, like, in 2000, it's probably 2006, 2007, somewhere around there. I had an executive come to me and say, "Oh, we need to build a dashboard." And I'm like, "Oh, that's just a trend. We're not going to build dashboards." Right? Because it's like, I needed to let it work its way through. I needed to work its way out before we actually, before I actually took it seriously. And I don't think we have I don't think we're in a place where we can do that anymore, because it's going to happen too fast. So, in order to talk about this model, I have to talk a little bit about the last book, Disrupting Data Governance, where I started researching disruption, because I knew that the book was going to be pretty disruptive to the data governance thought leaders at the time. And so the interesting thing is the ideas I came up with around disruption at the time for that book were long planted before that. I had been thinking about disruption for a really long time and how I thought about people. I would categorize people when I would work with them. And the primary reason I did that is because I am very much a disruptor. Like, I am completely okay with getting in there and saying, well, none of this works, let's chuck it.
Yeah.
And I would find people in an organization that would either work well in that sense or not, right? So I could see the other people that were like, oh yes, you're right, it doesn't work. Let's figure out how to blow this up. And I don't mean that in a literal sense, of course, but in a figurative sense, right? It's like, well, none of this is working. Let's start over. Let's start from scratch. And then I would find those people that could do that, or find those people that could kind of work with me. And so I started categorizing these people. And then I wrote the book about data governance and what disruption means. And then as I was thinking about what happens when disruption just completely overwhelms you, which is kind of what's happening in modern worlds with AI, I put a lot more thought into what this model would look like. So there are 3 profiles that I talk about in the book: disruptors, optimizers, and keepers. So disruptors are people like me, and they typically get all the attention, right? It's they are really, we love to create chaos a little bit. Like, oh, if I get bored, I just start, picking where I shouldn't be. And they will often seek out change on purpose. We're very good with ambivalence. We are very comfortable starting from scratch. I don't like anything that remotely looks like rules or authority. And maintenance tasks are my nemesis, right? I mean, those are disruptors. And those people are natural for, sort of starting things from scratch, but they tend to also create a lot of churn in organizations if you're not careful. I'm sure you've all worked with people that were kind of like this, and it was just after a while, it was impossible, right? Because it's like, just stop it. We have to work. We have to create some consistency here. So there are 2 other profiles that work well with disruptors. They're called optimizers, which I consider to be very much bridge builders. Optimizers love efficiency, and they look to optimize whatever they can, right? They like creating really solid foundations and kind of tweaking from there. They can kind of look like a disruptor sometimes, but that's because they're looking for efficiency, right? They see something and maybe it's just not working at all. So then they try to optimize it. And sometimes that means they have to start over from scratch. They can do that sometimes, but it's not because they just want to blow stuff up to see what happens, right? So optimizers are very comfortable with change, but they're always looking for ways to improve things. They don't do change just for change's sake. And they can navigate contrarian views with ease. That's why I call them bridge builders. They're very good at dealing with disruptors and bridging that gap over to other types, including other optimizers, but specifically keepers. So keepers are what I would consider to be the unsung heroes of sustainable disruption. They're named really for their steadfastness in keeping the lights on and the doors open, and we all need them, right? But keepers don't make the news because they're just doing their job. You're a keeper when you document to create a record for future use, right? You see the value, and that's the way we've always done it. And you only adopt change when it's clear, well documented, and necessary. You're not just going to adopt change because somebody said so, right? And so these 3 together are the model that we can bring forward to create a high level of sustainable disruption. Because it's not just one of them. It never could be just one of them. You really need every role in order to participate in different ways. So I call this the sustainable disruption model, or SDM. And what we're looking at here is the balance of each, right? So disruptors, optimizers, and keepers. And it's very dependent on the project. So for example, if you're trying to navigate a chaotic industry and create your own niche, let a disruptor lead the way, right? So I don't know, blockchain or, cryptocurrency, even AI and social media in the beginning, you needed somebody that was pretty disruptive in order to kind of get in there and start the stuff from scratch. It's a natural thing for them to be able to do. If you got a product that needs more consistency and reliability, so Disruptor started something, but it's not sustainable the way it is, you need an optimizer to come in there and create a lot of foundational aspects of it so that you have some consistency and reliability, right? And then if you're running, oddly enough, guys, if you're running a data governance function, keep your disruptors pretty far away from that function, right? And let keepers take the helm, because governance is really about creating that consistency, that reliability, making sure that you're applying standards, being methodical about all of that, right? And governance is a great way for keepers to kind of, you know, be in many respects lauded for their natural inclinations. And so there's always an overlap of each of them depending on the project. And there is, I go into a fair amount of detail about how to balance each of these as you're navigating through AI in terms of what that might mean for your organization. But I do think that respecting each of these profiles for what they truly are, not giving all of the attention to disruptors or even optimizers, but recognizing that when a keeper says to you, well, that's the way we've always done it, they're trying to share with you that there have been some really hard lessons that have been learned by doing it that way, right? They're not just trying to stop you from progress. So I'll stop there. Any questions?
There are
Comments?
no questions on the chat. Are there any questions from anybody? And this certainly looks like the profiles of the different people that you have on teams, in terms of those who want to maintain the status quo and those who want to change, and it's about understanding them. Is that a similar type of approach?
Yep. Yeah, it is. It's really about understanding yourself and how you play in this space. It's understanding other people. And everybody has different, so I tend to be a very alpha disruptor, but everybody has secondary tendencies, right? So I'm a little bit of an optimizer. And so everybody has a little bit of each, really.
Okay.
Yeah.
I see Drew's hand is up. Drew, question from your side?
Yeah, I always used to be called a troublemaker, but I see I've got a new title now, which I quite like.
Yep. I have been called a troublemaker, a rebel rouser. Yeah, I've been called out all kinds of things. As I'm,
Drew, is that
Drew,
is that an optimizer or a disruptor? Which one?
Probably the disruptor, and then I optimize what I disrupted.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Absolutely. Excellent. So, the question becomes, what's next? I mean, I don't know, right? I have no idea. I'm not a future maker, right? I don't read trends. Obviously, I thought dashboards were a trend. So I'm not a futurist by any stretch of the imagination. But what I do know for sure is that AI capabilities are only going to expand over time. And the things that we call AI now are probably going to look really parochial in a few years. And it's going to be a really very tumultuous probably next 3 to 5 years in the data industry and the way we've thought about it. So, in the short term, I think organizations are likely going to overestimate the value and capability of AI tools. And I think we're going to see a lot of volatility in the job market, which I really in the last 6 months we've seen, big data organizations sort of being let go. Big chunks of those organizations are being let go. We're starting to see a lot of prompt engineer job titles coming up, things like that. So we're going to see a lot of volatility in the job market as we all sort of come to terms with what this means in our organizations. So I hinted earlier at this idea of being future ready. So we used to call it future proofing. And I always felt like that was crazy because it's I don't know how to future proof because I don't know what the future is going to be, right? To me, future ready really means that we anticipate, but we don't try to predict that we're ready for change because we don't know what that change is going to be, particularly when we're looking at AI and what's next, particularly when we're looking specifically at commercializing AI and what is next. So I think one of the things we should all be, sort of anticipating now is the inevitability of obsolescence for our data functions, like data repositories and things like that. Like, how does that work? Because if we really hold tight to the way we've always sort of done that in terms of creating data platforms, I think we'll be outstripped pretty quickly as organizations try to come to terms with that. So, building teams and methods around deprecating what doesn't work. So if something's not working, let's not hang on to it real tight. The reality here is that organizations are going to move too fast. But that balance, again, of bringing your disruptors, optimizers, and keepers together will help you identify appropriately what's not working. Because if you ask a disruptor that question, they're going to answer that question as well. Nothing's working. It's not working right because it needs to go faster, right? So you don't want to ask a disruptor that question. They need to be part of it, but they can't be leading that charge. So being future ready really means considering the inevitability of obsolescence for a lot of the work that we're building today. So where I think the magic kind of happens is when we take the sustainable disruption model, starting with people, knowing and understanding how they're going to approach disruption through this sort of disruptors, optimizers, or keepers profile, and the idea of becoming future ready and building a lot of stuff, assuming that we're going to have to pivot or change quickly, right? And the ability to let stuff go, being really pragmatic about it. So the one thing I will say is the one thing right now that I learned when we're talking about bridging unstructured, semi-structured, and fully structured data in our data repositories, today, the only thing that answers all of that question are knowledge graphs. So if I were you, I'd start doing some research on knowledge graphs. They're really interesting. They've been around a really long time. Concepts of knowledge graphs have really been around a long time. But right now, they are the only things that truly allow you to bridge all three types of data. Yeah, and so it begins. Yeah. So, sorry. Yeah, go ahead. Is there a question?
There are a couple of questions. Magella?
Yes. Laura, what is your opinion about the future of artificial intelligence, business intelligence, analytics for SMEs, for small and medium enterprises? I know the big thing is the cost, okay, the investment, but these tools and technology mainly is focused on a big company. What about SMEs?
Right. Yeah. 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 I mean, most organizations fall into that sort of small, mid-sized, right? And those are the ones that are probably going to struggle the most with trying to figure out what this means for them. As I said earlier, commercializing AI as that happens, it will become more and more reasonable for smaller organizations to bring it in. That does not reduce the risk associated with it. So I think that's probably one of the big things. I have a couple of recommendations in the back of the book around, how to get started. One of them is the most important thing in my mind. If you're a small to mid-sized organization, you want to understand what this is, just create a little bit of a learning team and start looking at how AI is being defined, what teams are doing, what other organizations are doing, how these algorithms are being built is critically important. So we didn't talk at all about responsible AI or the ethics of AI, but it is a really important part of the work that has to happen. And if the organizations that are commercializing AI can't or won't do it, then the organizations that are going to buy the commercial products of AI need to. So understanding enough to be able to apply some of those responsible and ethical AI principles is critically important. So that's why I think every organization that's starting to think about AI needs to start first by learning a little bit. And I don't think anybody has to run out and get a PhD in AI. But you can, read some resources. There's plenty of YouTube videos. Start a conversation in the organization and figure out what that means for yourself. So it's probably the easiest spot to start. So I'll just leave that there. That's a big one.
Okay. And then there was a question from DJ that said he referred to your comment on dashboards and fads. he asked the question to say, do you think there's any way to recognize or differentiate between new developments in AI that are here to stay and those that are merely passing? I suppose you've been saying that not really.
Yeah, I think it's really hard to predict what will take hold. And I think what will take hold, unfortunately, is what sells. So,
Yeah.
we're not always totally in charge of that. But I do think that AI is here to stay in different kinds of ways. So in other words, is AI a trend? No, it is fundamentally different. It's been around since the 50s. I joke in the book that there's a joke in the book that says it took me 66 years to become an overnight sensation, right? That's AI. It is here to stay. The trajectory, how this goes, and how it's commercialized, the only way we can know for sure what's going to happen is what sticks based on what's sold and bought. So.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I hope that was helpful.
Yeah.
Excellent. So I will tell you this, my best personal advice is give yourself some grace as you navigate these changes because they're big. These are big ones. The ways we talk about data in the data industry, how we define it's different than the AI ML space. There are people that have lots of experience and degrees in AI and ML, and those are different than the experience and degrees that we have. So there's big changes that are coming. So give yourself some grace to do that. Take some time to learn from some reputable sources, like that book Artificial Intelligence by Melanie Mitchell. There are some non-reputable sources, and that's always the worry. But you guys know how to figure that part out. But just learn. Take some time to learn. And then the reality is we all have to find a way to navigate this change. Because if we dig our heels in, we're not going to be part of the change. And I think that is really important, is how do we become part of this future? And we all have a role to play in that. And so taking that from where you kind of authentically come from, whether that's being a disruptor, an optimizer, or a keeper, I think can really, really help you navigate all that is to come. So that's it. I think I did okay on time, maybe a little over.
Fantastic. Yes, you did. So there is a question from Tessa, and I think you mentioned it. You said you had some things at the end of your book. She asked, what are the features of successful AI adoption in an organization, and what does it look like?
Yeah, that's a great one, Tessa. So to me, successful AI adoption means you are governing it, which if you've read Disrupting Data Governance is probably a shock. The reason I say that is because right now, as you're looking at the industry overall, that commercialization of AI is kind of going crazy, right? Everybody wants to play in that space. We're seeing a lot of AI washing, but we're seeing an enormous amount of investment in AI. And nobody is stopping long enough to think about the impact, what that means, and how to do it well and respectfully. So I think the main thing is for any organization to do this, to take this on, you have to learn, but then you have to start with governing. And you can do that by balancing some of these disruptors, optimizers, and keeper profiles. So you're doing all the things that you're needing to do, but you're speeding up the pace in which that happens. So to me, it is really about governing this and thinking about methods of responsible AI and ethical AI.
And Laura, just an extra question there, because in a way, you're talking to the data management people, but we also have to take this conversation to the business people that may even feel more threatened by what some of that enhancements or machine learning can do.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And that's one of the reasons why I talk a lot about how you operationalize governance functions in the new book. Because one of the things that, business people hear governance, they think, oh, great, this is never going to go anywhere, right? You're going to stop everything. And that's one of the things I talk a lot about in the data governance book is our bureaucracy has gotten in the way. So now in the new book, I'm talking about, well, you really have to introduce governance because we do, because the speed and scale in which these, systems operate is very, very fast paced. So we have to find a way to balance that governance aspect of it.
Tessa, did that answer your question?
Yes, it did. I do think, though, that with governance and bringing in stability, so you have to have stability for governance when it gets to a stage where it's being monitored and the processes are being followed. And what I've seen in organizations that with processes, there's always massive change management to change processes in organizations. So it's going to become such a neck-on-neck race with the governance and the advancements or the continuous disruption that we're going to have with AI. The other thing I'm also thinking that, at the moment it seems there's just a lot of experimentation and very specific use cases, and it's got to get approval before it can go ahead and so on. So, it's going to take a long time to settle, I suppose. But it's difficult to define the use cases if one doesn't know what AI can actually offer. So it's a little, I don't know if it's a chicken or an egg, basically.
Yeah. You do have to take time to learn a little bit about it in the organization, right? In order to even articulate use cases. That's absolutely true. Yep.
Thanks.
Amin, your hands up.
Hey, Howard, thanks. Hi, Laura.
Hello.
Laura, you started off with giving us a history of what made you start writing this book. You mentioned about a disruption. Now, after writing this book and at this moment, where are you now? How do you feel?
In terms of disruption?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it's funny because I've always considered myself to be a very disruptive person, but AI has made me question that a little bit because, I'm not jumping on the bandwagon just yet, because it does make me nervous, and it makes me nervous because there are a lot of things that are not understood, and so. And because I've spent 25 years in the data industry and know that a lot of enterprises don't always take data management best practices to heart. So there is a pragmatic part of me that is a little bit worried about what's happening and what that actually means. But as a result of doing all of the research and talking to a lot of people in this space, I'm not as worried as I was in the beginning. So that's the good news. There's still a lot of work to do. And I do worry about our enterprises and how we can be really thoughtful about this work. But yeah, overall, I would still consider myself to be much more disruptor than the other things. And I think we can all find a way to bring this forward in a way that feels, authentic and manageable. Maybe less manageable.
And I suppose it's quite a bit of, in the context within the organization, one may be a disruptor, but you're not a disruptor on the international scene. So there's different levels of disruption and appropriate disruption.
Yeah. And the thought model sort of introduces this idea that you can change your operating profile, your primary profile. So I'm a disruptor, right? But after I had my son, I wasn't for a while because I had enough disruption at home. Right? I had to kind of keep things quiet. So
Right. Fantastic. Laura, thank you very much. Is there any last question? Any last question for anybody? Okay. Laura, I would just like to thank you, and I know that the last part is to nominate a person. I'm happy to do it. would you still like me to do it, Laura, or do you have
Yeah.
any strong
that would be-
feelings?
Nope, that would be great if you could do that.
Okay, so I believe the one that asked a few challenging questions for me was Gabriel. I know he's left, so I will contact him. Laura, I just wanted to ask you, when we worked with Technics Pub, some of the authors on Technics Pub, we were able to get a copy signed via Steve Hoberman. I'm not sure if we have the possibility of getting the book signed by you to Gabriel. Is there any possibility, or?
Because it's so new, I haven't signed any copies for Steve yet.
Okay.
So, yeah, that's a good point. I'm sure we'll run into each other eventually, and he'll have some signed copies. But
okay, all right. Thanks. So you are with Steve. I'm assuming it's with Technics Pub.
Yes, the book was written with the Technics Publications. That's right.
Okay, great. So I managed to ask Steve to help me with the previous one. I think it was with Mark Atkins' book on governance needs risk mitigation. So is it okay with me to liaise with him to get a signed copy from you?
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Great. Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate it. Laura, thank you so much for sharing. It was really nice. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your time.
Cheers,
Thank
everybody.
you so much. Thank you, everyone.
you.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you.
Have a good
Bye-bye.
day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.